Hello, everyone. I am very happy today to introduce you to my friend slash online acquaintance, Costa Koutsoutis. Did I get it right?
Koutsoutis.
Koutsoutis. Um,
Yeah.
and Costa is, in many ways, I think you and I have a very similar track in that both teachers, or I was a teacher, and
hmm
are you still
I'm an
teaching?
adjunct. Yeah, I'm an
Oh, very
adjunct professor of literature and composition at a couple of different places.
wonderful. And you and I both dabbled in comics for a little
Yeah.
bit, which I think is how we kind of met up uh,
Online. Yeah.
online. And then both made the jump into writing fantasy, in particular, short form, online, crowd funding. It's a very similar path, but I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. So I appreciate you taking
Oh,
time for
awesome.
me to to turn this into digital content so that it can feel official.
You're making me blush. Thank you very much. I'm always
Yeah.
happy to talk about myself.
Well, and this is a funny thing. Like ever since COVID, it was like we all discovered Zoom, and I was like, hey, I can now come up with excuses to talk with people that I've been been
Excuse
online
me.
with for a long time. It's a weird thing because you and I have never met in person,
No.
but I'm very familiar with the stuff that you've been doing. I've always been like, yeah, he's a cool guy. Do you know him?
Oh, thank you.
No. His girlfriend looks great. He looks like he's living his life.
Oh, wife, but thank you.
Wife, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, when I first saw her, she was your girlfriend,
Yes, that
and
tends to
then
be how it goes.
it usually does, yeah. And then I see you guys get married, and then so I'm like in past David, and then
Yeah.
and then I'm like, oh, you get to see the whole narrative play out, and yeah, so it's just kind of funny that then we get a chance to talk. So, but the thing that really interested me is what you're working on right now, which we will get into just a second.
hmm
But I'm curious into kind of what was the track from comics to what you're writing now? Was there a progression, or was it just like I'm ready to try something different?
I always wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
And I would always like, write like my little like things in my diary. Um, and then in high school, when I really wanted to write, and I started right, and then college started, and I had internet access, and I discovered online writing communities, and I was like, I could totally do something. And thankfully, I got rid of it. I wrote like my first like weird high fantasy thing that's truly awful. It was posted on like some fantasy author forum thing. I got into comics because I wanted to write. I liked comics. I figured I could write comics. I studied comic scripts. I used to doodle cute notes for a girlfriend I had at the time, and she was like, "You could just do comics, just draw the comic." And I was like, "Sure, why not?" And coming from a punk DIY background, I was like, "Just do it all yourself. Get a free cheap website and just put them up." Right?
Yeah.
It's the 2000s. It's the glory days of the internet, and then that sort of escalated. But comics is a lot of labor when you're drawing and writing, and it just I couldn't sustain it. But I'm an okay artist, but I think I'm a better writer. So I decided at one point to just sort of shift to writing and doing short fiction and collections. And I discovered Smashwords as a platform that allows you to for free like publish your own work. And I think at the same time also it must have been like 2008 to 2010, a lot of blog publishers were running blogs that published short fiction, and especially genre stuff, which is sort of like what I've has always been my bread and butter, even as a reader. So I would like pitch there, and then I was like, oh, one-off and serialized fiction. So it just that's kind of where it came from, and that's kind of where it's been since. And I used to write nonfiction a lot. I did a lot of freelance work and like music journalism. I used to write for Razor Cake magazine back in grad school, like a million years ago. I edited like the literary magazine when I was in grad school. Like did content stuff. So it's been a weird, rambly road that finally brings me to now.
Yeah, it's interesting because even talking about comics, and maybe my experience may be a little bit different than yours, but Kazu Kibuishi, who worked on Amulet, he did Daisy Cutter. He referred to creating comics as the world's slowest typewriter.
Yeah, I believe that.
And there's this idea that you're like, either you are an artist or you're working with an artist, and it takes so long to produce something, that there is something that's really nice about, oh, I wrote something last night and you can read it today.
Hmm.
Like there's something about that is very satisfying. And as someone who is a writer but not an artist, um, at a certain point, while I love artists and I have a lot of respect for them, I was kind of worn out, maybe too heavy of a phrase, but I didn't want to tie my fortunes to them.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Where I was like, my success depends solely on you. Like, you better do a good job or else this is all wasted. It was just like, I just kind of wanted to depend on my own work and let it stand on its own. And what have been some of the things that you've noticed about the switch between comics versus writing prose, writing genre fiction?
So oh man, now I'm remembering the first real comic thing that I wrote like a short, like OG, like graphic novel script that was
Yeah.
like an action thing. And I asked around online among friends, like, hey, does anybody know any artists? Anybody who's interested in doing comics? I would really love to work with somebody. And a friend of my girlfriend at the time was like, I know this guy. He likes comics and manga. He's an artist. He'd love to do something if you have something written. And it went nowhere. Right. I got like a couple of pages here and there over a span of 5 years. So it just went nowhere. And then, I ended up writing a one-off. I'd done this series of horror short stories about a sort of like supernatural Sherlock Holmes type, and that had been inspired by a script for like some contest that just I didn't win, where they were like, pitch your horror contest, some sort of thing. But a friend on Twitter, Steven Garza, who's an artist, was like, "Oh, I'll draw it for you if you want. Like, you don't have to pay me." And so that was like my only good experience, really, because it kind of came together, and you know, so like you were saying, there's a level of sort of like almost tactile um, pleasure in being able to say like, I wrote this last night. I'm going to put this on this free website that I host. It is all just words. Read it,
Yeah.
right? And it's the flip side of that kind of depressing aspect of, I just type words and they just go into the ether. But I can just type words and they can just go into the ether. Whereas
It's all how you say it.
when I worked on comics, oh man, I never liked my own art, and I always felt that there's always more you could do in the post-production phase of lettering and fixing like the contrasts and everything. And I just, the words are there and they came out exactly how they were in my head. So it's just go.
Yeah. Well, and I've been to New York City, where you live in New York City.
Yes, born and
Uh,
bred,
there we go.
unfortunately.
And I was there for the Mocha Art Fest.
Oh, I
It
love
was
Mocha. I miss that
so
fest.
great. It was at the Puck Building, the year that I was there. And I remember my mind was blown being there, because it was the first time where I was at a convention and people were like, "Oh, I've never heard of this before. I want to get one of each." Where
Yeah.
usually I go to a convention, it's like, "Oh, I've never heard of this before," and then they just walk off.
Yeah, because it to me, Mocha always felt like it's zine culture, right? And
Yeah,
zines are all about, oh, like they're a buck each. Sure, here's $5.
yeah,
Give me the five zines that you made. So it was very much part of that like community aspect and element to it, and also because they were so much more low stakes,
mhm,
right? If I give somebody $2 for a thing that was made at Kinko's, if it doesn't work out, eh.
yeah,
But if I fork over $20 for a slick graphic novel that somebody made, which good for them, right? Because the
yeah,
production process is harrowing, and I don't like it. I kind of feel like I just threw $20 down the toilet.
yeah. Yeah, and it was that whole just that mentality of kind of like, I've never heard of your stuff before, and I like that. That's like a
Yeah,
selling point. Whereas I
it's a
feel
different
like,
crowd.
yeah, and I got kind of worn out in comics having to continually explain to the Star Wars fan why they might want to read my slice of life, interpersonal. Like, I was like,
Yeah,
this is not my crowd. Whereas, and this is, we're going to pivot to what you're working on. with epic fantasy, if people are fans of the genre, they'll give you a chance. They're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I love epic fantasy. Cool. I'll pick it up and see what I think." And
Mhm.
I don't have to do as much of the pitching to people who are not my crowd when I'm writing genre fiction, because it's just like, "Oh yeah, I love epic fantasy. You're writing epic fantasy. Cool. Yeah, let's give it a check and see what we think."
Yeah, I think so because you're like, you'll always check it out.
Yeah.
Like if you're in the scene, so to speak, as loaded as that phrase might be,
Yeah.
you have the expectations, even if they end up being completely sort of like flipped or going against them. You're a little bit aware of what you're getting into. You know what you're going to get. You know about the level of suspension of disbelief to have going into it, the level of criticism or lack thereof. And it's the same, I guess, with to an extent with horror and science fiction and crime fiction and all that stuff that I love. Like, if it's sort of kind of similar, of course I'm going to check it out. And that's what
Yeah.
I love about it. There's a level of there can be a real deep seated level of like, yeah, you seem cool. Like the loyalty is there.
Yeah. Well, and even I think the one thing that with writing though that I think is different in comics, the indie artist, the indie creator has always been very respected, I think. Now, maybe not well paid, but if you're an
Yeah, yeah,
indie
yeah.
comic book creator, people are like, "Oh, cool." In the world of like publishing, like traditional publishing, it's
Yeah.
called vanity press. It's just looked down upon. And I feel like that's changing.
I don't know. I feel like it is too, but I went like on a depressing tangent a couple of days ago on Twitter about that, about
Yeah.
like there's still a bit of a stigma if you're like a self-published or indie published guy,
Yeah.
and how some places, like even if it's a completely predatory publication, they would rather you have real publications to your name than a history of okay sales putting out your own work in ebook format,
Yeah.
right? And it's a crowded market. Like all of a sudden there's a level of respectability to genre fiction like fantasy, and it's not even just like the post Dungeons and Dragons, post Game of Thrones. It's just more popular. It's more crowded. So there is that level of like more people are like, yeah, it's cool that people are doing it their own way. But still, like the old vanguard of publishing, I think, still has a lot of sway, unfortunately. But there are slowly cracks in that, as I guess if you follow publishing Twitter, you see a lot of people who work at these at publishing houses who are editors and uh, agents, and like they're just like, I can't do it anymore. Like the old system is not necessarily working.
That I would definitely agree with. That there seems to be a situation where, I mean, when you look at people in your city in the New York publishing world, I mean,
Oh
that's where they all are, and it consists of a lot of highly overeducated and underpaid people who are all kind of swarming in
yeah.
trying to do. I mean, everyone there has like Ivy League. I mean, it's really crazy to the point that like I feel like the system is kind of breaking because you go, wait, I've been working at this publishing house for 10 years. I'm still an associate level editor, and all I do is dig through the slush pile, and like I'm barely getting paid. And that model is not working when all of a sudden you get people like Will White, who's completely independent, and he's making seven figures. So it's like,
Yeah, I mean, like, because obviously, like, it's impossible to, here it's just becoming like really I don't know if it's untenable. Unsustainable is probably a better word.
yeah,
And I think the fact too that like New York tends to be associated with serious artistic literature. I was chatting with a friend of mine one day on campus a couple of years ago, obviously pre-COVID, and we were joking about like, oh, I mentioned that like I gotten something published or whatever, and my coworker was like, oh, what is it? And I said, oh, it's a crime story, right? I wrote a crime story based on like a real murder that happened in my old neighborhood. And he's like, oh, I didn't know you liked that, and publishing that. I was like, yeah, I'm not everybody who comes out of like NYU and you know literary fiction MFAs. They just write about like their parents' divorce and weddings on Long Island. And my friend's like, oh, well, my coworker was like, oh, well, a friend of mine just published a book. And I was like, what's it about? And he got real quiet. He said, it's about a wedding on Long Island. I was like, see,
There you
it,
go.
no one uh, but yeah, I don't know. I like genre
Yeah.
fiction. I've always loved genre fiction ever since I was a kid. Even before I wrote, fantasy and horror were my original loves.
Well, and that's a good point, because I feel very similar in that it's like, people talk about like write what you know, but I actually think a better way to think of it is write what you love. Like you look and you go, wow, that's the stuff that I really enjoyed. Why am I not doing that?
Yeah.
Like, why aren't I writing the stuff that, really got me excited when I was a kid? So, what were some of the things that you really got into with fantasy when you were younger?
Well, besides I guess the standards of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis,
Yeah.
I was and I still am and respect him immensely, huge fan of Raymond E. Feist,
Yes.
the Rift War books.
Yeah.
And from there, I got into Janny Wirtz and Mercedes Lackey. And I was a kid who was really into historical fiction.
Yeah.
So, who was it?
Is it Bernard Cornwell or whatever? Or
I actually have never read any Cromwell, oddly enough. I was just talking about somebody with that. But oh my God, I forgot her name. The Eagle of the Ninth.
yeah, yeah, I don't remember.
The Eagle of the Ninth and the Silver Branch.
Rosemary
Rosemary
Sutcliffe.
Sutcliffe, yes. Stuff about Alec, because coming from a Greek American background, obviously I read stuff about like Alexander the Great, and
Yeah.
that type of sword and sandal stuff I loved. So that, along with Feist and Lewis, C.S. Lewis, and Tolkien, and all that, and that was like what and originally laid the groundwork to me for fantasy. And then I have to admit this, when I really started to think long and hard about like great modern fantasy storytelling, I watched a lot of Japanese anime in high school and college because, man, oh man, if you want to talk about like an untapped field of real either classic fantasy or truly groundbreaking stuff, a ton of it was in there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
no, I completely agree. I had a moment where I was reading some was it Naoki Urasawa. I think I was reading Pluto. And as I
yeah,
was reading that manga, I was like, wow, it's like I'm enjoying this more than anything I can remember enjoying in a long time. And I was
yeah.
like, there is just a wealth of great stuff there. And I almost was a little bit upset. I was like, why am I discovering this now?
Well, just because it's old doesn't mean it's
Yeah,
old and to you. It's still new to you.
exactly. So tell me a little bit about the Howl of the Earth.
So I've had this idea for this fantasy world that I always wanted to do something with, and like to the point that I drew maps when I was like a teenager. And I don't just like, no matter what I wrote, say sci-fi or horror or crime stuff or nonfiction or my master's thesis, um, I always it never left that spot in the back of my brain, in the lizard brain, right?
Yeah,
And I wanted to write like an epic fantasy story. And I had this idea because the world building is one thing, but the actual sort of narrative is another. And I was like, well, what would be a good idea? So I came up with this, following my favorite type of writing, where start simple, start small, don't worry about world building explicitly on the page, just sort of unravel naturally. I figured, well, what's the best kind of fantasy adventure? A person goes on a journey. Why would they go on a journey? So I started working on it a couple of years ago, and then recently decided to use my Patreon to actually serialize it.
very cool. Very cool. And your Patreon is patreon.com/Costa K Writes.
Yes,
With
COSTA K Writes.
And I will put all of that information down below in the description so people can check it
Thank
out.
you.
And I think it's a great model because for only $2 a month,
For
people
two
get
bucks a month,
Yeah, they
Oh, I'm
can
sorry,
get
go ahead.
access. Oh no, they can get access to these stories that you're doing kind of a serialized format with it.
It is 2 chapters a month, every month of the book. At the $2 level, you also get access to a bunch of other stuff. I write a lot on Patreon. I'm currently in the middle of, you can see it's actually got its notes in it. I'm in the middle of an essay series on Glenn Cook's The Books of the North from the
Oh,
Black Company.
nice.
Last year, I did a series of essays on Tolkien. I do book reviews. You know, there's older, sometimes there's one-off short fiction. There's also essays in general, so you can get a bunch of stuff, even at just the $2 level.
Yeah.
But yeah, this year's big draw is 2 chapters a month of this fantasy book about, a former soldier who got a sweet retirement package, getting sort of called back by his old commander, and these two other figures being asked by their king to sort of go on this journey and find something. And it leads to the secret that nobody really knew was there ever there.
Very, very nice. Oh, and I love the model. I mean, we could talk all day just about Patreon and crowdsourcing models, but I love the model where um, obviously I'm not going to do this with every writer that I read, but sometimes it's really cool. This is always the advice I give to people who want to get into Patreon is I say, okay, pick 3 people and just support them at their lowest level for like a few months just to kind of see what they're doing. And there's something really cool about seeing people's process, kind of seeing what they're working on and kind of seeing it kind of roll out so that, you're like, oh, wow, I was reading that back when it was on Patreon. And now it's like this whole thing that's, collected. And your chapters are going to end up being a finished novella when you're done with it.
That's the plan,
Yeah.
yes. So basically it's going to be patron only, but when we're done, I'll be publishing the sort of novella by itself as a sort
Yes.
of as a ebook that anybody can buy,
Yeah.
which is a model I've done before where I was using sort of free chapters, and then eventually I sort of collected the whole thing and then released it as a book. But this is the first time I'm doing it where the chapters are not open to everyone, right? And I'm trying to sort of essentially drum up business, as it were, to be cynical. But I'm trying to sort of use Patreon as a way to get people engaged with the work and be like, hey, for $2 a month, you're gonna get a bunch of material from me, including a book.
Yeah.
But the book is just going to be bit by bit by bit, so you can find the tag and go back and catch up if you're new. And it is, if you like classic adventure fantasy, like that's kind of what I'm bringing here. I'm trying to dig up and bring that to you.
That's really great because I was thinking, even looking at the image, and I love the cover that you've got kind of posted on your Patreon. Um,
Oh,
but
thank you.
it does have this sort of like almost historical fiction fantasy. It feels like it's really rooted in an older time. Whereas sometimes I feel like there's some fantasy, which is still really great. It's such like a high magical world that it doesn't feel medieval at all. It just feels
Yeah. I
crazy.
have weird feelings about a lot of fantasy in terms of magic and in terms of how much of it borrows from the sort of the key aspects and elements to it. And I didn't want to, it's I guess a little bit spoilery. Should I,
Go for
you
it.
know, there are some magical elements to my world, and there are some elements of it that are not just, oh, this is historical, this is like a medieval history. But to me, I didn't want to immediately sort of jump into mechanics and systems and uh, automatically dumping sort of the exposition of the whole world to the reader, because they're not going to encounter a bunch of that stuff until they need it. So to me, that's sort of, and this sounds real bad and a little mean because it sounds like I'm making fun of people who play like RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons, but like that D&D-ification of fantasy is not really my bag. I
Yeah.
don't care about how magic works, and I don't really care about just how cool the world is from you telling me. I want to sort of slowly figure it out, right? Even going back to some of the classics of like The Hobbit, right? The Hobbit literally starts the sentence like, there once was a hobbit who lived in a hole.
Mhm.
I think that's the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it starts small and builds out from there. And not everybody who will be the narrator or the protagonist of a story is going to have the knowledge of everything that they see. So like sometimes you just sort of have to go along for their ride and trust the author,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And you're talking to someone who, like, I love D&D, but I think that there's a lot of D&D novels and novelizations that don't quite work. And I think one of the reasons why is when everyone in the tavern is a magical world beating person, then it takes a little bit of that wonder away from it because everyone
Yeah.
is amazing. And so it's like you're just tripping over adventurers left and right. And then there's no sense of, oh wow, this person just did something that I've never seen before. And it just blew my mind. It's like, no, I see that every day when it becomes more of a D&D type world.
Something I like and I got from crime fiction is that some people are just trying to get by, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of fiction set in a world that feels lived in. Everybody in this world is just trying to get by, right? Not everybody is a hero or an epic villain or is part of some sort of larger machination. People are just people, and even the protagonist is they're just a person.
Yeah.
Being like, all right, I guess like I'm gonna go do this because it's a job and it's a paycheck, or oh, I'm bored here and I kind of need something new in my life, so I'm just gonna go do it. And that's I steal that heavily from writers like Lawrence Block and Elmore Leonard and Donald Westlake, who wrote very realistic crime fiction of people who were not super geniuses or particularly evil or malicious. They were just either working class, working man characters living their lives, or had the cunning to live day to day to day.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the gritty aspect of, not every sword has to be a magical sword. Sometimes the magic is just the fact that I was able to hold on to it while I
Swords are
was swinging.
expensive, man.
Yeah. Yeah, like sometimes, yeah, it's just the wow, I'm better at sword fighting than I used to be. Let's celebrate that instead of the idea that I can like slice through everything without a care in the
Yeah.
world.
Or not even that. Like, oh hey, I guess I survived through sheer dumb luck. Let's maybe take care of some bathroom issues away where nobody can see, come back and continue to be heroic.
Yes.
Right? Let me
Oh,
go clean up and then I'll come back.
exactly. Well, and for our J.R.R. Tolkien purists that might be watching this, the line is, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit,"
Ah, I got him wrong.
which you got to admit, like, I know that J.R.R. Tolkien is not always lauded for his, like, just the literary quality of his writing, but I think the guy is one hell of a writer. Just
Um,
in a
I
hole,
love him. I
in
love
a,
his work. I love
yeah,
his prose. Yeah.
in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. There's something about that line that I'm just like, oh, that is changed nothing. Like,
Exactly. No notes. 10 out of 10.
yeah,
Right. It's in a like it's a simple setting using wording that we know that ends with the strange fantasy element. So the slow unspooling starts there.
yeah.
And even then continuing in The Hobbit, right, or There and Back Again, we don't really get a ton of truly fantastical elements for a nice chunk of the book.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right. It's just a an eligible bachelor who's getting harassed by a bunch of people in his house.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of those things that I think we don't even think about enough is sometimes fantasy can get really bogged down with like the names and like in that first paragraph, I've read some fantasy people where I'm like, okay, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I trust that I will eventually. But I love that this one sentence, the only word I don't know is hobbit. And that's
Yeah.
the thing that he focuses on. But the other thing is whether you're talking about the novel A Game of Thrones or you're talking about The Hobbit, it starts with something very relatable, either dude being harassed at his house or someone has to move because of a job promotion. like like it's something that's infinitely relatable. It's like, oh yeah, I got a new job and now I've got to move the family.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that's what happens in Game of Thrones. I'll be honest, I read those books once
That's
when the
enough.
show started, but that's a whole other story. Yeah.
It's a lot, but like, but I do like the idea that fantasy gets rooted in some stuff that can be very relatable, and that's part of the fun. Now, let's talk a little bit more about your book. Now, how are you feeling right now with the writing process? Is it getting exciting? Is it kind of ramping up? Or are you kind of where are you with all of that right now?
There's a piece of advice that I've always heard that I tell people to, because as a teacher, I teach writing, and
Yeah.
I actually started a new term today, and I have a fresh batch of students who are learning to write. And a thing I always tell them is like, the work's not going to get done if you don't just sit down and do it.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of at the stage in where like you, I just have to sit down and do it. I have another manuscript that's almost done, and it's like a hard hump part that I'm just like, I just have to sit down and do it. It
Yeah.
will not, and I'm at that part because there's always the part when you start writing. I feel especially in fantasy, because I've written some short fiction as well, where when you first get started and in your mind, you're in the world and you're like, oh, I'm going to introduce everybody to this world. It's great. And you're just, next thing you know, you've written like 3 to 6,000 words in like the first sit down, and you're like, this is great, I can totally keep this up. I am past that stage, and I know you know what that's like, because there's some days where you just have to sit down and do the work. Inspiration is nice, but deadlines are more important.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, and yeah, with this process, I think the good thing is with your Patreon is you've been doing this for a while, so that you know how to set those deadlines for yourself, and you know how to kind of push through. Sometimes the inspiration comes and you're just, yeah, you knock out several thousand words and bleary haze. But I have found in rereading my work that I can't always tell the difference between the hard nights and the easy ones when I'm reading it. It all kind of comes out the same for me.
Oh, you're lucky then. I can tell when I've been struggling. I can absolutely tell when I've been struggling. Although I recently, and this is like real nuts and bolts stuff, I
Yeah,
recently started a process of I'll write until I hit a problem, and then I just stop,
yeah.
and then I start mapping out the problem by hand,
Hmm.
and then essentially like, what is this, and writing out questions, and then I answer the question, and then I'm like, oh, okay, that's how I solve the problem. Because I know when I was younger and I would try and write, if I came across in the writing of a story, I came across an issue, I would either give up or sort of hand wave something away, right? But a good linear narrative always, I think, needs to show to an extent, right? Like how something gets done, how something gets solved. And it doesn't have to be point by point, incredibly obvious, but all right, they get here. All right, well, what's going to happen? There's going to be a conflict, and then they move on. Well, what happens in the conflict? So for example, relatively early on in the Howl of the Earth, there's a point where the characters have like their first conflict, their first battle, so to speak. And I had to tell myself, well, how would these characters fight these sort of antagonists at this point? Are they going to go all in, revealing everything, or are they going to, or is it the first hint we really get of action and violence in a story that, for the most part, has not really had any action or violence? And also, too, I feel as if, and this goes back to what we were talking earlier when it comes to sort of how fantasy talks about itself and how fantasy sometimes writes and describes things. Conflict and combat is ugly.
Mhm.
War is bad. Violence sucks, pardon the language. I'm not particularly interested in describing the exact way in which somebody is expertly and beautifully using like their magic longsword to cut up some poor bandit who is like trying to rob you with a pitchfork, right? So to me, the intricacies of that are not quite as important necessarily as just bam, bam, bam. All right, this happened, which leads to this, which leads to this. We're done. Moving on to the next sort of transitionary part of the narrative, to the next setting and next conflict.
It reminds me a little bit. I just finished reading Kindred by Octavia Butler. And one thing I noticed about Octavia Butler
I
is
have that
that,
somewhere.
yeah, oh, it's an amazing novel. But one thing I noticed is she doesn't go into a lot of physical descriptions of the violence, but instead she goes into sort of the emotional truth of the
Hmm.
violence, which makes it far more difficult to read. And I mean
Yeah,
that in a good way. Like it's painful to read it, and you're just sitting there just going, "Oh my gosh, this is so terrible." But she didn't go into graphic description of every blow or act, but it was the emotional aspects of it that just you put the book down and you're out of breath. You're just wiped out.
yeah. I mean, you have to think about the subjectivity of the narrator and of the characters, right? Like, how are they going to experience action?
Yeah.
Again, to go back to the other thing I'm doing, I'm working on this, series about. Have you ever read any of Glenn Cook's fantasy?
I've not. I'm familiar with the name. I haven't read it though.
One of the really great things about these books is, to me personally, is that it's about a group of mercenaries engaged in this sort of like massive war, and the narrator is a member of this group of mercenaries, and he sort of is the protagonist. We don't really actually get a lot of descriptions of war and combat and magic, because A, the protagonist is a medic, but also B, how do you describe like a field of battle where 100,000 things are happening all at once, right? All you can really do is describe what you're feeling watching people fight, people die, people essentially scrabbling over yards of earth,
Yeah.
right? It's very much like you said, much more like emotional, much more sort of how characters are feeling and reacting. And I really, really sort of like that. And that's sort of what I kind of try and do. Obviously, you're describing action because you need to describe things that are happening, but I don't try and get hung up on the minute descriptions of this, that, and the other.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and I should say, on the nights where I am writing slowly versus the nights when I'm writing fast, I think the difference is on the nights that I'm writing slower, I'm aware of what all is wrong with it. On the
Oh
nights
yeah.
that I'm on the nights that I'm writing fast, I don't realize where I messed up until afterward. And I go, "Oh, I just kind of zipped right through that part, didn't I?"
Right, because you're in the zone.
I'm
When
in the
it's ro-
zone. I don't know how bad it is yet.
but when you're going slow and you're agonizing over 300 words, you can see every single one of those words in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm exactly the same, and I have to force myself to not turn the internet back on and just go on Twitter,
Yeah.
or start watching like videos on YouTube or something.
Now, do you find as a teacher that your self-editor is harder to turn off?
I don't really know, because I teach nonfiction, I teach research,
Yeah.
and I mostly write fiction these days. So I try and not let, to me it's like two different parts of my brain. Uh, so not necessarily, although I think it's inevitable. I think in the comments in the manuscript that I leave myself when I pause tends, when I stop for the night or stop for the day, tends to be where that comes out. I will switch the font color to like red and hit caps and just start writing notes to myself about what should go here. And it's always like, this sucks. Erase the rest of this. Why is this here? Holy shit. Um, you know, better transition, correct that last action scene. You suck. Close the computer, go to bed. So that's
Yeah.
probably where it shows up.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. I remember leaving a note to myself that I didn't even remember that I wrote. And it
Oh
was like,
God,
I
yeah.
looked back at it and it was like, this paragraph is boring the hell out of me. And I was like, damn, I am a harsh editor of myself. And then I read it and I was like, oh yeah, that is boring.
I always leave notes to myself to remind myself to double check that I've got names right,
Yeah.
because I will forget how I spelt people's names. Yeah, so sometimes you see those notes you left for yourself, and you're like, "Ooh, man, why am I yelling at myself? Why am I so mean?"
Oh yeah. Well, such is the life, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I want to wrap this up, but I do want to remind people that you're on Patreon and they go to Costa K Writes. Link will be down below. I really recommend people because once again, it's a great model. Like people can hop on for $2. they can check it out. I've got the prologue open in front of me right now,
The prologue is
and
open for anybody to read for free.
see, that's
Um,
great. Yeah, so people can kind of get a chance to look at. So even if they don't initially drop those $2, which they should, at least they can read the prologue and get a sense of where it's going. And I think that's, I don't know, I'm excited about this. This is one that
well,
yeah,
thank you.
it's going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to see what you keep writing here.
Chapter 1 launches the 11th of this
Okay.
month, and then chapter 2 actually launches the 25th, and we're continuing a twice monthly schedule with that through the rest of 2022 until the story of these characters of Hennef Blackrush and his friends resolves itself in one way or another.
Yes. Well, and I'm as I said, and just also as just kind of a nerd of the whole industry, I'm excited to see how this model works for you, because you've been on
Thank
Patreon
you.
for a while, but
Yeah.
the model is interesting because I feel like we're all kind of searching to figure out, okay,
What
there
works?
there's yeah, there should be space for indie creators. Like I realize that there's always going to be the Penguin Random Houses of the world, but there should be space for indie writers. I don't need 10,000 fans, but give me 100.
I'll take 10,000 fans.
Yeah, I'll take it. But like,
Yeah.
but how do I make things interesting with just 100 people that I know will
Yeah.
read whatever I write?
Can I also promote one more thing?
Go for it.
Oh, I was gonna say, I also have another. You can actually find a bunch of other stuff, including books that I've written. My latest short story collection. It's called Stronger Than Swords. It is a collection of fantasy and science fiction stories. It is available through my website, costak.wordpress.com. I have an Itch.io page, actually. That's probably the best way to get copies of all my books. Links are all on my website. But
Great.
yeah, patreon.com/CostaKWrites. Sign up, $2 a month.
Very good. I'm looking at your website right now. I will include that link as well.
Thank
And
you.
now, did you do the covers? Because I do like the covers.
I did do the covers. I
Nice.
haven't done all the covers to all my books.
Yeah.
The cover to my detective collection, Running the Train, was done by Thatcher Cleveland, who's also a fellow writer of like horror and stuff like that. And the cover to my an old novella, spy novella of mine that's still available called The Follower, was done by artist Lauren Denizio. Lauren is also the singer and guitarist of the punk band Warriors.
Nice. Well, yeah, you'd mentioned your sort of punk upbringing. I think yeah, it's interesting to see people who've kind of grown up in that. They remain creators. Like I've noticed that about a lot of my punk friends. Like you
Because
can't.
we're always gotta do something.
Yeah.
Gotta do something. Restless. We're perpetually restless.
Exactly. Well, Costa, it was great talking to you.
It was great talking to you too. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, absolutely.